this was going to affect Indigenous peoples across the world in many ways. And so they actually said they're going to go back, and they're not going to announce the plan right away, and they're going to go back and do consultations with Indigenous peoples all around the world about what the effects would be and what are Indigenous people's sort of concerns about this forest plan that they had. And so they did some of these consultations. Some of these consultations, well, they ended up in a walkout, for example, of Indigenous groups in Latin America who sort of really just straight rejected the proposals. And from what I hear about Asia, they just basically said, unless you meet this stringent list of criteria, these programs aren't going to work. And it was basically a rejection of the entire principles that the World Bank had detailed their plans upon. And so when we got to the UN, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we had a lot of these things in mind, and a lot of the experience and knowledge and understanding of Indigenous groups around the world, and their sort of understanding in relation to this forest plan of carbon sequestration. And going in with that, we outlined a number of complaints in the general forum, but the time when the actual write-up of the recommendations from the forum came, it seemed that there was some paragraphs added in there that didn't come specifically, weren't documented by the number of participants there, but came from sort of the official recommendations, the expert considerations of the Permanent Forum representatives, which were sort of out of line with what a lot of the actual Indigenous participants were directly claiming themselves. So there was a little bit of a confusion from the first part about that, but really a direct disagreement over some of the fundamental principles involved in these carbon plans. And so once we realized that these things were being put in there sort of as recommendations, and that the World Bank's plan should be enacted with certain caveats, which was in direct contradiction of what a number of groups were saying, we issued a statement to the Permanent Forum members saying that this is not actually what we want, but we want instead the Permanent Forum to recognize that a number of groups, Indigenous groups, are against these plans and do not support these plans, and we have reservations about the way these things are going through. And so our proposal, the first was very simple, that we wanted these sections of the recommendations that said specifically that these things should go through, and these represented potential beneficial plans for Indigenous peoples to be taken out of the list of recommendations. And it took a number of days of deliberation and a lot of consultations, a lot of meetings, but in the end, they didn't do that. In the end, they supported adding a few other paragraphs that sort of said there are some reservations, there are some concerns that Indigenous people have about these plans, but didn't strike from the record, actual support for the plans. And we talked with some of the members of the Permanent Forum who had been generally pretty supporting of us in the principle, but they said there was some opposition from within the Permanent Forum membership that didn't allow us to take out these specific paragraphs. And some people have very vested interests and are coming from different places and different representations that didn't represent what grassroots Indigenous peoples were saying about these plans. And so on the final day, we sort of helped organize a protest at the Permanent Forum body when it seemed like there was no actual recognition besides that few paragraphs, but they wouldn't agree to strike from the record some of these other paragraphs that were of concern and sort of look to commodify what it looked like us. It was an attempt to support the commodification of these forest plans and other plans that were threatening to Indigenous peoples. So we supported this protest. We supported a sign-on supporting that these paragraphs should be stricken from the record. Got almost 40 Indigenous groups that were present at the Permanent Forum to sign on to this. And then when the time came at the end that they didn't act on anything, a number of groups, especially from Latin America, who were very concerned about this, coming from the Amazon in particular, staged what you could call a protest, but basically it was they were trying to make their voices heard and try to get the Permanent Forum membership to listen to them and strike these matters from the record. And at the end of it, they were allowed to speak, but the end result was, after an emergency meeting of the permanent forum membership, they came back and basically responded and said, we already heard you from before, and that's why we added these paragraphs, and we don't see why we need to strike these other paragraphs. And so it represented basically a complete that they were really basically not listening to what the Indigenous membership was saying to them.